The room had been built for legends long before legends realized it. Low amber lights washed across velvet walls, and the air carried the quiet confidence of a place that had seen history walk in without knocking. This was not a crowd that shouted to be heard. It listened, measured, and waited. The stage stood modestly elevated, polished just enough to reflect the shoes of the man who now stood at its center, holding a microphone as though it were an extension of his breath rather than an object demanding attention. Frank Sinatra did not perform for applause anymore. Applause followed him the way shadows followed light, inevitable and unannounced. He began softly, letting the first notes settle into the room like a shared secret. His voice carried familiarity rather than force, the kind that did not demand silence because silence arrived on its own. Every word seemed to land exactly where it was meant to, brushing against memories the audience didn't know they still carried. People leaned forward without realizing it, not out of excitement but recognition. This was a man singing to time itself, and time was listening. Just off to the side of the stage, partially hidden by the curtain's edge, Dean Martin stood with his hands loosely folded, watching not the crowd but the room. He had learned long ago that the room always told the truth before people did. Dean wasn't smiling, though his face carried its usual calm ease. He observed the subtle things, the way a waiter froze mid-step, the way a man near the front shifted in his chair more than necessary, the way a hush sometimes meant anticipation and other times meant restraint. Dean knew the difference. As Frank moved into the second verse, the energy changed, not sharply, not loudly, but unmistakably. A ripple passed through the audience like a breath drawn too quickly. Somewhere near the aisle, a chair scraped the floor. It was the wrong sound, too harsh for the mood, too sudden to be ignored. Dean's eyes followed it instantly, landing on a man rising from his seat with a stiffness that did not belong to admiration. The man's face was tight, jaw clenched as though holding back words that had waited years to be released. His fists were already balled, not in applause but intent. Those closest to him shifted away, sensing something unspoken but dangerous, the way animals sense weather before it breaks. Frank continued singing, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the disruption. He had faced anger before on stage and off, and learned that fear fed it faster than resistance. But this was different. The man stepped into the aisle, then another step, then another, his pace accelerating as though something inside him had finally snapped loose. A gasp fluttered through the room. Someone whispered Frank's name, not loudly enough to warn, but loudly enough to reveal fear. The man's eyes were locked on the stage now, burning with a purpose that had nothing to do with music. Dean moved before the thought fully formed. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not signal security or draw attention to himself. He stepped forward calmly, placing himself between the curtain and the open stage, his body language so relaxed it almost felt inappropriate for the moment. Yet there was something in that calm, something heavy, settled, unmovable, that caused a few nearby men to pause, as if instinctively recognizing authority without knowing why. The furious man reached the edge of the stage just as Frank finished the line he had started seconds earlier, his voice unwavering even as the tension thickened the air. The man lifted his arm, anger finally spilling into motion, the intent unmistakable now. Time seemed to stretch, not slowing but sharpening every detail, the glint of sweat at the man's temple, the soft echo of Frank's last note fading, the faint click of Dean's shoe as he stepped fully into view. Dean Martin did not raise his hands. He did not block the man aggressively or grab his arm. Instead, he spoke, quietly, almost conversationally, as though addressing a misunderstanding rather than a threat. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying just enough weight to be heard by the man and no one else. "This isn't who you want to be tonight." The man hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Rage had prepared him for resistance, for shouting, for humiliation, but not for calm, not for someone standing between him and his target without fear, without challenge, without ego. Dean's eyes met his directly, not hard, not cold, but impossibly clear. Behind them the room had fallen silent. Frank had stopped singing, sensing the shift at last, though he did not move away from the microphone. He trusted Dean without question. He always had. "You don't know me," the man snapped, his voice shaking now that the moment had arrived. "You don't know what he did." Dean nodded once slowly, as though accepting the truth of that statement without needing to argue it. "You're right," he said. "I don't. But I know this. You came here carrying something heavy, and you don't want to leave with it heavier." The man's arm lowered slightly, uncertainty creeping in where fury had lived moments before. People often expected Dean Martin to charm, to joke, to disarm with humor. What they rarely expected was his ability to see pain without flinching from it. Dean wasn't negotiating. He wasn't performing. He was offering the man an exit that preserved dignity. Security had begun to move now, slowly, carefully, unwilling to escalate a situation that seemed to be diffusing itself in the presence of something they could not define. The man glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him, of the silence pressing in from every side. His anger no longer felt righteous. It felt exposed. Dean leaned in just enough for the man to hear him clearly. "Whatever brought you here," he said softly, "it doesn't end the way you think it will. Walk away now and this stays a moment. Stay, and it becomes the rest of your life." For a long second, no one breathed. Then the man stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived. He looked at Frank, then at Dean, then at the floor. Without another word, he turned and allowed security to guide him away, not roughly, not triumphantly, but quietly, like a storm that had decided not to break. Dean did not watch him leave. He turned back toward the stage instead, giving Frank a small nod that said everything was handled. Frank smiled faintly in return, lifting the microphone again as the room slowly remembered how to breathe. When the music resumed, it sounded different, not weaker, not interrupted, but deeper. The audience understood they had witnessed something rare, something unscripted and human. Not a confrontation, but a choice. Not dominance through force, but strength through restraint. And somewhere in the quiet that followed the applause, the lesson settled in without needing to be spoken. The music continued, but the room was no longer the same room. Something invisible had shifted, like a fault line settling after a tremor, and everyone could feel it even as they pretended not to. Frank Sinatra sang on with the same measured grace, yet the notes carried a new gravity now, as if the silence that had interrupted them had left a mark. Applause came when it should, but softer, more thoughtful, as though each pair of hands understood they had nearly clapped too late for something far more important. Behind the curtain, away from the lights, Dean Martin stood alone for a moment, letting the noise of the room wash past him without entering. His pulse was steady. That surprised even him. He had stepped between danger and consequence countless times in his life, though rarely on a stage, and almost never with so many eyes poised to turn a single wrong move into legend or disgrace. What lingered with him now wasn't fear, but the look he had seen in the man's eyes just before the anger broke, something older than rage, heavier than hate. Dean poured himself a glass of water and did not drink it right away. He stared into it as if the surface might reflect more than his own face. Rage, he knew, was rarely born in the moment it appeared. It was carried, folded and refolded over years, pressed into someone's chest until one wrong note, one wrong memory, one familiar voice could tear it loose. Whatever that man had brought with him tonight hadn't started here, and Dean suspected it hadn't been meant to end here either. Out in the hallway beyond the club's main room, the man sat with his head in his hands, flanked by security who now seemed less like guards and more like reluctant witnesses. No one had restrained him. No one had scolded him. That somehow made everything worse. His hands trembled, not from adrenaline anymore, but from the sudden absence of it. He had come prepared to explode, and instead found himself diffused by a calm he couldn't fight without looking like a fool, or worse, a child. One of the security men cleared his throat gently, asking if he needed water. The man shook his head. He did not trust his voice yet. His thoughts spiraled back years, to a night that smelled of cheap whiskey and disappointment, to a radio left on too loud in an apartment that felt too small. Frank Sinatra's voice had been there too, always there playing through moments that had not ended the way songs promised they would. The man had blamed the voice because it was easier than blaming memory. Back inside, Frank reached the end of his set and bowed once, not dramatically, but with the respect of someone who knew the weight of being listened to. The crowd rose to its feet, applause swelling again, this time with relief braided into it. They had come for a performance, but they were leaving with something less comfortable and far more lasting, a reminder that admiration and anger often shared the same roots. Dean returned to the edge of the stage just as Frank stepped down, the two men exchanging a look that did not need words. Frank's eyes asked a question. Dean's nod answered it. Everything that mattered had already happened. "Buy you a drink?" Frank asked quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Dean smiled faintly. "Only if it's boring," he said. "Tonight's had enough excitement." They walked together toward the back, their pace unhurried, refusing to let the night define them by its sharpest moment. Dean could feel the eyes on them, not curious now, but reverent. People wanted to understand what they had seen, to turn it into a story with a clean beginning and end. Dean knew better. Real moments never tied themselves up neatly. They lingered. They waited. As they passed the hallway, Dean slowed. He glanced toward the door where the man still sat, unseen by the audience, wrestling with the aftermath of his own intentions. For a brief second, Dean considered walking past. No one would blame him. The moment had been handled. The danger was gone, but something in him refused to let the story end at restraint alone. He stopped. Frank noticed and said nothing, trusting Dean's instincts as he always had. Dean walked toward the man, his steps measured, his posture relaxed. The security guard stiffened, unsure whether to intervene, but Dean lifted a hand slightly, not a command, just a suggestion. They stepped back. The man looked up, startled, shame flickering across his face when he recognized Dean. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but no words came. Dean saved him from them. "You don't owe me anything," Dean said quietly, sitting on a chair opposite him without invitation. "And you don't owe him a punch to prove you're hurting." The man swallowed hard. His voice cracked when it finally surfaced. "I didn't mean to." "I know," Dean interrupted gently. "That's why you stopped." Silence settled between them, thick but not hostile. Dean let it sit. He had learned long ago that silence, used correctly, could carry more understanding than argument ever could. After a moment, the man exhaled shakily. "I thought if I did it, if I just let it out, it would finally be over." Dean nodded slowly. "It never is," he said, "but walking away gives it a chance to become something else." The man looked down at his hands again, this time as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The fury that had filled them earlier felt distant now, almost foreign. What remained was exhaustion and something dangerously close to relief. Dean stood, adjusting his jacket. "Go home," he said, "and when you hear a song that reminds you of something you lost, don't fight it. Let it pass through. That's how it stops owning you." He did not wait for thanks. He did not offer advice beyond that. He turned and walked back toward the light, leaving the man with a choice that felt heavier and more honest than any punishment could have been. Behind them, the night resumed its rhythm. People laughed again. Glasses clinked. Stories began forming, already bending toward exaggeration. But the truth of what had happened lived somewhere quieter, in the space between restraint and rage, where a single calm voice had rewritten an ending that could have ruined several lives at once. And though no one on stage would say it out loud, the room understood something fundamental before it emptied that night. Strength did not announce itself. It stepped forward when it was needed, and stepped away when it was done. Morning did not arrive gently for anyone who had been in that room. It crept in with the dull persistence of unfinished thoughts, settling behind the eyes and inside the chest, where moments replayed themselves without asking permission. For Dean Martin, the night returned in fragments rather than scenes: the scrape of a chair, the weightless second before a decision, the unmistakable shift that occurred when anger realized it had nowhere to land. He sat at his kitchen table long after sunrise, untouched coffee cooling beside him, aware that what stayed with him wasn't the danger avoided, but the calm he had chosen in its place. He had learned over years lived in public that most men mistook volume for power. They believed force created endings. Dean knew better. Force only multiplied stories. Restraint ended them quietly or transformed them into something survivable. That was why the man's face kept returning to him, not contorted with rage as it had been on stage, but emptied afterward, as though something poisonous had finally drained out. Dean wondered where that man would wake up this morning, and whether the silence he had offered would feel like mercy or punishment. Across the city, the man woke with a start, heart racing as though the night were still unfolding. His apartment felt unfamiliar, like a place he had outgrown without noticing. Sunlight cut across the floor, revealing dust he had stopped caring about, reminders of a life paused mid-sentence. He sat up slowly, pressing his palms against his eyes, expecting shame to crash down on him in waves. Instead, what he felt was worse and better: clarity. The memory returned with brutal precision. His arm raised, his intention sharpened into certainty, and then the interruption, not physical, not humiliating, but human. A voice that had refused to meet his anger on its own terms. A look that hadn't flinched. The man realized, with something like disbelief, that no one had tried to win against him. They had simply given him room to stop losing. Later that day, the story began to spread, but not the way stories usually did. There were no headlines screaming violence, no sensational retellings of fists flying or chaos erupting. Instead, the night circulated in quieter tones, traded between people who had been there and those who hadn't, each version slightly different, each missing the same thing: the truth that nothing dramatic had happened, and that was exactly why it mattered. At a small diner across town, someone mentioned how Frank Sinatra had stopped singing without a word, how the room had held its breath. At a bar near the freeway, another said Dean Martin had talked a guy down with nothing but his presence. The details blurred, but the feeling stayed intact. Something dangerous had approached, and something steadier had stood in its way. Frank heard the whispers too, though he pretended not to. He had spent a lifetime learning which stories deserved oxygen and which deserved to be starved. This one, he felt, belonged to the people who needed it most, not to the papers, not to the microphones, not even to history. He carried on with his schedule, his voice as precise as ever, but there were moments now between songs when he paused just a fraction longer than usual, letting silence say what applause could not. For Dean, the consequences arrived unexpectedly. A letter appeared first, unmarked, slipped under the door without ceremony. It was short, unpolished, honest to the point of discomfort. The man wrote that he had gone home and slept for the first time in months, that he had called someone he had been avoiding for years, that he had not known what to do with anger once it was no longer allowed to perform. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for a reply. He simply said thank you for not turning his worst moment into his only one. Dean folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with things he did not display: old photographs, ticket stubs, reminders of nights that mattered for reasons no one else could see. He understood then that restraint was not passive, it was contagious. One quiet decision had created space for another. That was how change actually moved, not in headlines, but in lives redirected by inches. Yet the suspense of that night did not end with relief. A rumor began to circulate that someone else had been watching from the back, someone who understood exactly how close things had come to breaking. A promoter, a rival, a man who thrived on spectacle and resented dignity because it could not be controlled. Dean sensed it the way sailors sensed pressure drops before storms, not as fear, but as preparation. Invitations came that felt heavier than usual. Rooms seemed tighter. Conversations paused a beat too long when he entered. Power, he knew, did not enjoy being shown up by calm. It preferred noise. It preferred winners and losers. What Dean had offered that night was neither, and that unsettled people who depended on predictable outcomes. Still, he did not change his pace. He did not sharpen his edges. He trusted that what had worked once would work again, not because it was safe, but because it was right. Frank noticed this, admired it silently, and stood beside him as he always had, not as a shield, but as proof that loyalty did not require agreement to be unbreakable. The man, for his part, made a decision of his own. He returned to the club weeks later, not during a performance, but in the quiet afternoon hours when chairs were stacked and the stage was empty. He stood where he had almost crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and felt nothing dramatic, only gratitude and an unfamiliar steadiness. He left without being noticed, which felt like freedom. What none of them could know yet was that the night would be tested again, not with fists but with pressure, with whispers, with a moment designed to force Dean to choose between escalation and the same restraint that had already proven its cost. And this time, the choice would not be private. It would be watched. The pressure arrived without warning, the way real tests always do, not as threats shouted from across a room, but as invitations wrapped in politeness and expectation. A private event was scheduled weeks after the night everyone pretended to forget, hosted in a venue far more exclusive than the last, the kind where reputations mattered more than talent and silence carried its own currency. The audience would be smaller, the eyes sharper, and the stakes higher, because this was not a place that tolerated uncertainty. This was a place where power liked to be reassured that it still owned the final word. For Dean Martin, the invitation felt heavier the moment he read it, not because he feared confrontation, but because he recognized the design of the moment. This would not be about rage bursting into the open. This would be about pressure, subtle, social, surgical, about pushing a man into reacting so that calm could be reclassified as weakness. Dean understood the trap clearly, and understanding it gave him no advantage except the ability to choose how not to step into it. The room that night gleamed with controlled elegance. Crystal glasses caught the light just enough to remind everyone how expensive restraint could be. Conversations floated carefully, each sentence polished before it landed, each laugh calibrated. Frank Sinatra stood near the center, effortlessly composed, yet keenly aware of the tension stitched invisibly into the walls. He watched Dean from across the room, not worried, but alert. He knew Dean would feel the pull to act, not to defend, but to clarify, and he trusted that whatever choice Dean made would be the right one, even if it confused everyone else. It came midway through the evening, a remark delivered with a smile too sharp to be friendly, a story retold just inaccurately enough to provoke correction, a suggestion framed as humor that the previous incident had been exaggerated, that perhaps it had been handled softly. The word lingered longer than it should have, heavy with implication. Heads turned subtly toward Dean, waiting. The room did not demand a response. It expected one. Dean felt the familiar sensation, the moment where reaction begged to be born. He could have spoken, explained, reclaimed narrative control with ease. He could have turned the story back on itself, exposed the manipulation beneath the manners. Everyone there would have applauded it. They loved clever dominance. They loved clean victories. Instead, Dean smiled. Not a dismissive smile, not a performative one, a small, genuine expression that acknowledged the comment without feeding it. He lifted his glass, met the speaker's eyes, and said only, "I hope everyone made it home safe that night." The room faltered. There was no argument to counter, no accusation to dismantle, just concern, quiet, human, impossible to twist without revealing cruelty. The tension shifted instantly, like a chessboard overturned by a move no one had studied for. Some people looked away. Others nodded slowly, recognizing too late that they had been invited to watch a spectacle and instead been handed a mirror. The man who had spoken laughed awkwardly, trying to recover the moment, but it had already slipped beyond his reach. Power drained from him without drama, without confrontation. Dean had refused the spotlight entirely, and in doing so, removed the oxygen the moment required to survive. Frank caught Dean's eye across the room and raised his glass, not in celebration but acknowledgement. This was the move people would talk about later, not because it was loud but because it left nowhere to stand except decency. The room resumed its rhythm, though something fundamental had changed. The hierarchy had not been challenged. It had been rendered irrelevant. As the night drew to a close, people departed quietly, conversations subdued, reflections internal. No headlines followed. No stories demanded retelling. And yet weeks later the effect became unmistakable. Invitations changed. Behavior softened. The kind of calculated cruelty that thrived on reaction began to lose its confidence in Dean's presence. He had become unpredictable, not because he was volatile, but because he refused to be provoked. The man from the original night never crossed paths with Dean again. But years later, he would tell someone that the most important moment of his life was the one that didn't happen, the punch never thrown, the life not derailed. He would say he learned then that strength was not about winning in front of people, but about walking away with yourself intact. Dean never told the story. Frank never corrected the rumors. They let the legend form incorrectly, because legends, they knew, were less important than examples. The true lesson of that night could not be captured in applause or headlines. It lived in restraint chosen under pressure, in dignity extended where punishment would have been easier. And for those who witnessed it, on stage, off stage, or from the shadows, the message stayed long after the lights went down. The strongest move is the one that refuses to perform. The bravest power is calm that does not ask to be believed. And the most legendary moments are the ones that leave no scars, only change directions.